They humiliated an elderly black man at the funeral, unaware of who he was to the deceased. But when the letter left behind by the deceased was read, the silence spoke louder than any words. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching from. The church stood on the edge of a small town, its red brick walls weathered by years of wind and rain. Its stained glass windows filtered the gray winter light, scattering muted colors onto the polished wooden pews. The air inside was thick with the scent of flowers, roses, lilies, and carnations arranged in careful clusters around the casket at the front of the room. Soft whispers floated through the space, blending with the occasional sniffle or rustle of fabric. The mourners sat stiffly, their black suits and dresses forming a sea of somber uniformity. Outside, the wind stirred the bare branches of the trees lining the cemetery. The sky hung low, heavy with the threat of snow. It was the kind of day that seemed made for funerals, where the chill in the air felt appropriate, a silent acknowledgement of loss. Inside the church, the pews were filled with the people of the town, neighbors, old friends, and distant relatives of the deceased. Most of them had known him their whole lives. He had been a fixture in the community, a respected veteran, a husband, and a father. The program handed out at the door described him in glowing terms, painting a picture of a man who had served his country honorably and returned to build a life defined by hard work and dedication. The crowd reflected the town itself, mostly white, middle class, and conservative. They spoke in hushed tones, exchanging memories and condolences. There were quiet tears and polite smiles, but the overall mood was one of reverence. This was their way of honoring a man they considered one of their own. Then the door at the back of the church creaked open. The sound was soft, barely audible over the murmur of conversation, but it was enough to draw a few glances. Heads turned and the conversations faltered. A man stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the gray light outside. He was old, older than most of the mourners. His suit was clean but worn, the fabric slightly shiny from years of careful ironing. He held a battered hat in his hands, twisting it nervously as he stepped inside. His dark skin made him stand out instantly. The whispers began almost immediately. "Who is that? Does anyone know him? Maybe he's at the wrong funeral." The man hesitated, his eyes scanning the room. He saw the stares, the furrowed brows, and the slight shifts in posture as people turned away or leaned closer to their neighbors to share quiet remarks. He clutched his hat tighter and took another step forward. A woman near the front row turned, her gaze sharp and questioning. She leaned toward the man beside her, whispering something that made his expression darken. The elderly man continued forward, walking slowly down the aisle. His steps were measured, but there was an unease in the way he moved, as though each footfall was a decision he had to make. When he reached the last row of pews, he stopped, standing at the edge of the gathering. No one acknowledged him. Instead, the whispers grew louder. "He doesn't belong here. What's he doing? Probably looking for a handout." The man kept his eyes on the casket at the front of the room. His face was lined with age, and his shoulders were slightly stooped, but there was a steadiness to his posture, a quiet dignity that refused to crumble under the weight of the stares pressing down on him. One of the mourners, a middle-aged man in a tailored suit, stood and made his way toward the back of the church. His steps were quick, purposeful. When he reached the elderly man, he spoke in a low voice, though the sharpness of his tone cut through the whispers. "I think you're in the wrong place," he said. The old man shook his head. "No, sir, I'm not." The mourner frowned, his eyes narrowing. This is a private service for family and friends." "I knew him," the elderly man said quietly. "I knew him a long time ago." The mourner's eyes flicked over the man's clothes, the scuffed shoes and frayed cuffs. He stepped closer, lowering his voice but keeping it firm. "This isn't the place for you. You need to leave." The old man's fingers tightened around the brim of his hat, but he didn't move. "I have every right to be here," he said, his voice steady despite the tension radiating from the younger man. The exchange drew more attention. Heads turned, and soon the whispers gave way to outright stares. A woman near the front stood and approached, her heels clicking against the floor. "What's going on?" she asked. "This man doesn't belong here," the younger man replied. "I told him to leave, but he won't." The woman's eyes swept over the elderly man, her expression hardening. "You need to go," she said. "This is a family gathering." The old man looked past her, his eyes fixed on the casket. "I knew him," he repeated. "I knew him better than most." "Listen, old man," another voice interrupted. "Do we need to call someone?" The suggestion hung in the air, and for a moment it seemed the old man might give in, might turn and walk out the door without another word. But then he straightened his back, standing a little taller. "I'm not leaving," he said. A ripple moved through the crowd. Someone muttered, "Unbelievable." The tension in the room thickened. The old man took a step closer to the pews, and the crowd shifted subtly, as if to block his path. "I just want to pay my respects," he said. "You're not welcome here." The words were sharp, final. The old man flinched, but he didn't retreat. Instead, he took another step forward, and the crowd bristled. The young man who had confronted him earlier reached for his phone, his fingers hovering over the screen. "I'll call the police." The old man's eyes never left the casket. "No need for that," he said softly. His voice was calm, but it carried a weight that stilled the room. For a moment, no one moved. Then the woman near the front stepped closer, her voice colder now. "There are seats in the back," she said. "If you insist on staying, sit there. But don't make a scene." The old man nodded and moved to the last pew, lowering himself onto the hard wooden bench. The ceremony began, but the tension lingered. Eyes continued to dart toward him, filled with suspicion and unease. As the preacher started to speak, the old man sat quietly, his hands folded over his hat. He listened to the words of praise for the man in the casket, his face unreadable. But behind his steady gaze, memories stirred, memories of another time, another place. And as the service continued, the whispers didn't stop. The preacher's voice echoed softly through the church, but the words seemed distant and hollow to the old man sitting at the back. His eyes remained fixed on the casket, yet his mind drifted far from the polished wood and the floral arrangements that surrounded it. The whispers still lingered, barely audible, but sharp enough to cut through the reverent tone of the service. They didn't stop watching him. Each movement he made, a shift in his seat, the way he adjusted his worn jacket, even the tightening of his grip on the hat in his hands, seemed to draw attention. The weight of their stares pressed down on him like the humidity of the jungles he had once fought through. The preacher's words faded into the background as the old man's thoughts carried him backward, pulling him into memories he had tried to bury but never could. The words of the man who had threatened to call the police rang in his ears. "I'll call the police." It wasn't the first time he had heard those words, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. He remembered the long drives through unfamiliar towns where he'd learned to keep his hands at 10 and 2 on the wheel and his eyes straight ahead. He remembered being pulled over more times than he could count, the cold metal of handcuffs once snapping around his wrists for no reason other than suspicion. He had survived a war overseas, only to come home to a different kind of battle. A quieter war, but no less exhausting. And yet he had never stopped fighting. The whispers in the church took him back to the whispers he had endured as a young man, walking through the wrong neighborhoods, wearing the wrong clothes, speaking with the wrong accent. He had been told to leave places before. Restaurants, shops, bus stations. It had happened so many times that he had stopped being surprised by it. But this felt different. This wasn't just another moment of being turned away. This was personal. This was about the man lying in that casket, the man whose life he had saved, whose face had been the last thing he saw before the smoke and gunfire swallowed him whole. His hands trembled as they gripped the hat tighter. The preacher's voice rose, calling attention back to the front of the room. "We are here to honor not only a great man, but a great soldier, a man who served his country with courage and came home to build a legacy of strength and integrity." The words were met with solemn nods and murmurs of agreement, but the old man's chest tightened. He wanted to stand and speak, to tell them what the man in that casket had meant to him, but he stayed silent. Not yet. Instead, he sank deeper into his memories. He could still feel the weight of the wounded soldier on his back, the way the man's blood had soaked into his uniform as he carried him across the open field. The sound of gunfire rang in his ears again, sharp and deafening. The heat of the jungle pressed against his skin, and his muscles ached with the strain of each step. He remembered the look in the soldier's eyes, fear, pain, and a desperate will to survive. "Don't let me die here," the soldier had whispered, and he hadn't. The preacher's voice jolted him back to the present. This is a man who gave everything for his family and his community, a man who faced adversity with determination and came out stronger for it. The words stung. The old man had faced adversity too. He had bled for his country, had risked his life for the man they were now celebrating. But no one had ever called him a hero. No one had ever thanked him for his sacrifices. Instead, they had looked at him the way these people were looking at him now, with suspicion, with fear, with judgment. A man in the row ahead turned and cast a glance over his shoulder. Their eyes met for a brief moment before the man turned away, his shoulders stiffening. The old man's jaw tightened. He wasn't going to leave. He had every right to be here. The preacher continued talking about the deceased's achievements, his military honors, his business successes, and his devotion to his family. The old man barely heard him. His mind was still back in the jungle, still carrying the weight of another man's life on his shoulders. He could feel the sweat trickling down his back, the way his arms had burned as he dragged the soldier toward safety. He could hear the shouts and the explosions, the cries for help that faded into silence as more and more men fell. But he hadn't stopped. Even when the bullet tore through his arm, he had kept going. He looked down at the scar that ran along his forearm, now faded with age, but still there, still reminding him of what he had given. And yet, here he was, sitting in the back of a church like an outsider, treated like a trespasser. The whispers rose again, louder this time. He should go. This isn't his place. The old man closed his eyes and took a slow breath. The service dragged on, and the preacher's voice seemed to fade further and further away. The old man's thoughts swirled, moving between past and present, between the jungles and the polished wood of the pews. He remembered the look on the soldier's face when they finally reached safety, the relief, the gratitude. "You saved my life," the soldier had said. Those words had stayed with him, even when everything else had faded. But now, looking at the casket, he couldn't help but wonder if they had meant anything at all. The preacher called for a moment of silence, and the room fell still. The old man bowed his head, his hands trembling as he clutched the brim of his hat. He had come here to honor a promise, to pay his respects to a man who had once been more than just a soldier. But, as he sat in the heavy silence, surrounded by people who refused to see him, he felt the weight of every unspoken word, every unacknowledged sacrifice pressing down on him. He wanted to stand, to speak, to make them see him. But he stayed seated. Not yet. The whispers had stopped for now, but he could still feel their eyes on him, still feel the weight of their judgment. The service moved forward, but time seemed to stretch. The old man shifted in his seat, his body aching from years of hard work and harder living. He felt the pressure building inside him, the urge to speak, to be heard. But he knew his moment hadn't come yet. He would wait. For now, he held his silence, letting the weight of the past settle over him as he stared at the casket and prepared for what was still to come. The old man remained seated in the back pew, his hands resting lightly on the brim of his hat. The whispers had faded into a strained quiet, but the tension still lingered in the air like the lingering scent of incense. The service moved forward, yet for him, time felt suspended, as if the world outside these walls had fallen away, leaving only the weight of memory and the cold eyes of strangers who had already decided who he was. The preacher's voice echoed through the church, speaking of legacy, sacrifice, and honor. The words rolled over him, but they rang hollow. Honor was a word he had carried like a shield once, but it had long since lost its power to protect him. Now it felt like an echo from another life, something promised but never delivered. He glanced at the rows of mourners, their backs straight, their eyes fixed forward. They had come to celebrate the life of a man they admired, a man they believed they knew. But the man in the casket was more than the image they clung to. He was more than the polished stories in the preacher's eulogy. The truth lay buried beneath the medals and folded flags, beneath the proud words about service and sacrifice. And that truth was about to rise. The preacher's tone shifted, drawing the old man's focus. "We are here to honor not just the life of a man," the preacher said, "but the legacy of his courage. There are moments in life that define us, not just for what we do, but for who we are in the face of fear." A murmur of agreement rippled through the congregation. Heads nodded, eyes turned back to the casket. The old man's heart thudded in his chest. He knew what was coming. This man, the preacher continued, was decorated for bravery. Many of you know the story, how he risked his life to protect his fellow soldiers in the midst of war. But there is more to that story than most of us realize. The old man sat up straighter. "I believe it's important to acknowledge," the preacher said, "that even the greatest heroes do not stand alone. Sometimes their courage is made possible by the actions of others, those whose sacrifices are too often overlooked." A ripple moved through the crowd. The old man saw heads turning, whispers reigniting like embers catching flame. He felt the weight of their eyes again, but this time it was different. There was uncertainty now, curiosity. The preacher paused, letting the moment stretch. Then he picked up a piece of paper from the podium, a letter, folded and slightly yellowed with age. "This," the preacher said, "was given to me by the family. It's something the deceased asked to be read today." The old man's breath caught. The preacher unfolded the letter and began to read. "To those gathered here today," the preacher read aloud, "thank you for coming to honor my life and my memory. But before you do, I need you to honor someone else, someone without whom I wouldn't have had the chance to build this life at all. The room fell utterly silent. The preacher's voice grew softer, but no less steady. There was a day during the war when I believed I would die. I was bleeding, broken, and left behind in the chaos of battle. I thought I'd never see my family again. But there was a man, a soldier, who refused to let that happen. He carried me through gunfire, through smoke, and death. He saved my life. The old man felt the weight of the room shift toward him. He could feel their eyes, but he didn't turn to meet them. The preacher continued. His name is Clarence Williams. He is here today. A gasp moved through the crowd. All the whispers, the murmurs, the judgments, everything stopped. Clarence's hands trembled. He gripped his hat tighter, his breath shallow. The preacher looked up from the letter, scanning the room. Clarence Williams is the reason we are here today. Without him, there would be no legacy to honor, no family to mourn, no life to celebrate. It is because of his courage, his sacrifice, that this man survived the war and built the life we now remember. For the first time, Clarence felt the weight of silence. It wasn't the same silence he had endured earlier, the cold, dismissive silence of exclusion. This was heavier, rawer. It was the silence of realization. He felt their eyes, but now they were searching, questioning. Slowly, Clarence rose to his feet. The movement felt deliberate, as if the years had settled into his bones, making every step an act of defiance. Faces turned toward him. He saw shame flicker in their expressions, shame mixed with disbelief and something else he couldn't quite name. The preacher gestured toward him. Clarence, we owe you more than we can say. Clarence didn't speak right away. His throat felt dry, and his pulse hammered in his ears, but he forced himself to meet their gazes. I didn't come here for this, he said finally, his voice low but steady. I didn't come for thanks. I came because I made a promise to never forget what we went through together. His words hung in the air, and for a moment, no one moved. Then someone near the front stood. It was a woman, a daughter of the deceased. Tears streaked her face and her voice shook as she spoke. I didn't know, she said. None of us knew. I'm so sorry. Others began to rise, their eyes filled with apology and admiration. Some murmured words of gratitude, others simply nodded, unable to speak. Clarence looked at them, and for the first time he felt the weight of years begin to lift, but it wasn't enough. This isn't about thanks, he said. It's about seeing people for who they are, not who you assume them to be. His words hit like a hammer, shattering the fragile veneer of politeness that had hidden their prejudice. I carried him because it was the right thing to do, Clarence said. Not because of his skin, not because of mine. Because he was my brother out there, and that's all that mattered. Tears filled more eyes. Heads bowed. Clarence let the silence linger, then turned and began to walk toward the door. But before he reached it, someone called out, Mr. Williams, please stay. He paused, his hand resting on the doorframe. He didn't turn around. You don't need me here to grieve him, Clarence said. You need me here to remind you that some debts can't be repaid with words. And then he stepped outside, leaving the weight of their guilt behind him. Clarence stepped outside the church and drew in a deep breath, letting the cool winter air fill his lungs. The hush of the cemetery, broken only by the rustling of bare branches and the occasional chirp of a distant bird, offered a reprieve from the heavy silence he had left behind. Yet the weight in his chest remained. It was not the same oppressive burden he had carried when he first arrived, but it lingered, an ache born not of anger but of exhaustion. The door creaked open behind him and footsteps crunched on the gravel path. Clarence didn't turn to see who had followed him. He already knew. "Mr. Williams," the voice called. It was soft, almost hesitant, a woman's voice. Clarence exhaled slowly and turned. It was her, the daughter. The tears she had shed earlier still left faint tracks on her cheeks, and her eyes were red-rimmed. She clutched a small bouquet of lilies, her fingers trembling slightly. I'm sorry to bother you," she said, her voice wavering. I couldn't let you leave like that." Clarence looked at her, waiting. He said nothing, but his expression softened. "I didn't know," she continued. "None of us did. He never told us, not about you, not about what you did for him." Clarence shifted his weight, his tired knees protesting the movement. "He wouldn't have," he said quietly. "He wasn't that kind of man." The woman's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Clarence studied her face for a moment before speaking. "Your father was a good man," he said, "but he carried shame. The kind of shame that doesn't fade." She blinked. "Shame? For what?" Clarence looked out over the rows of gravestones, their gray edges softened by patches of frost. "For surviving," he said. "For needing help, and for owing that help to someone like me." Her lips parted as if to protest, but the words died before they could form. Clarence could see the struggle in her eyes, the desire to defend her father warring with the truth she couldn't deny. "My father wasn't a racist," she said at last. Clarence nodded slowly. "Maybe not in the way you think," he said, "but that doesn't mean he wasn't shaped by the world he lived in. We all were. And some marks don't wash off, no matter how hard you try." The woman's shoulders sagged. She looked down at the bouquet in her hands, then back at Clarence. "Does it make it any better?" she asked. "Knowing he asked for you to be here today?" Clarence thought about that, about the letter, about the preacher's words, about the sudden shift in the crowd when the truth came out. He thought about the stares and the whispers, the subtle cruelty that had followed him the moment he stepped through those doors. "It doesn't erase what came before," Clarence said finally, "but it's something." The woman stepped closer, her gaze searching his face. "What can I do?" she asked. "What can we do?" Clarence looked at her, seeing not just her guilt but her sincerity. He had seen eyes like hers before, on soldiers, on survivors, on men and women trying to make sense of the world they had been left with. "You can start by teaching your children better," he said, "by telling the truth, not just the parts that make you proud, but the parts that make you uncomfortable." She nodded, tears welling in her eyes again. "I will," she promised. "I swear I will." Clarence didn't doubt her sincerity, but he also knew the weight of promises made in moments like this. Guilt could be a powerful motivator, but it was often fleeting. "I hope you do," he said, "but don't do it for me. Do it for them." She reached out then, hesitating for just a moment before offering her hand. Clarence looked at it, then took it gently, his calloused fingers brushing against her smooth skin. "Thank you," she whispered. Clarence released her hand and turned back toward the road. Behind him, the church door opened again, and more footsteps followed. Voices called his name, tentative, uncertain. He didn't stop. They had already taken enough from him. The drive home felt longer than it should have. The empty road stretched out before him, the horizon blurred by the fading light. Clarence's hands gripped the wheel, his knuckles pale against the cracked leather. He thought about the soldier he had carried through the jungle, about the weight of his body and the heat of his blood. He thought about the nights after the war, when sleep was a luxury he couldn't afford, and he thought about today, the whispers, the stares, and the silence that had followed the truth. He didn't know if the preacher's words had changed anything. Maybe they had for a moment. Maybe the people in that church would go home and tell their families about the man who had saved their neighbor's life. Maybe they would remember, but Clarence had lived long enough to know how quickly memories faded. The sun dipped below the horizon, and shadows stretched across the road. Clarence let out a slow breath and turned onto the narrow street that led to his house. It was small and weathered, with peeling paint and a sagging porch, but it was his. He pulled into the driveway and sat for a moment, staring at the darkened windows. The weight in his chest felt lighter, but it was still there, a reminder of everything he had carried and everything he had lost. He stepped out of the car and walked to the porch. The wood creaked beneath his feet, but he didn't mind. It was a sound he was used to. Before he went inside, he paused and looked back down the street. For a moment, he imagined the faces he had left behind. The daughter, the preacher, the mourners who had finally seen him for what he was. Not a stranger, not an intruder, a man. Clarence turned and opened the door. And as he stepped inside, he whispered a quiet prayer, not for the man he had buried, but for those who still had time to learn. Thank you for watching this video. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories. Share this video with your friends. Let it be a reason for reflection and discussion. Leave comments where you're watching from, and see you in the next episodes.